Usually when we talk about like a medical diagnosis,
Hmm.
there's this expectation of just absolute precision.
Hmm.
You break your arm, they take an x-ray, you look at that glowing film, and there's a jagged white line.
Right, it's right there.
Yeah, the doctor points to it, you nod, they put a cast on it, it's visible, it's categorized, and honestly, it's comforting.
Because it treats the body like a simple machine. I mean, a part broke, we identify the part, we fix the part. We just love binary problems like that.
We really do. But then you step into the world of macroeconomics or the flow of global wealth, and suddenly you realize that X-ray machine is completely useless.
Oh, entirely useless.
Right, because we are looking at a diagnostic landscape that is incredibly murky. It's a system made of millions of moving parts, human psychologies, and invisible transactions.
And trying to isolate the broken bone in a global economy is often an exercise in ideological projection rather than an actual diagnosis.
Yeah.
People tend to see what they want to see based on their own political predispositions.
Which is exactly what makes our goal today incredibly challenging, but also, I think, completely fascinating for you listening. We're pointing a highly analytical, heavily scrutinized X-ray machine at one of the most influential and historically charged diagnostic manuals of modern economics.
Yes, we are.
We are doing a deep dive into Volume 2 of Karl Marx's Capital, specifically the text located in Volume 36 of the collected works of Marx and Engels, edited by Friedrich Engels.
And taking on this specific text really requires a very specific approach from us. Because this book is so fundamentally tied to massive political movements, revolutions and geopolitical struggles of the 20th century, we have to establish a sort of sterile laboratory environment for our discussion today.
Exactly. We are officially putting on the lab coats.
Lab coats are on.
Just to be totally clear up front, we are not here to endorse Marxist viewpoints, and we are certainly not here to take sides in the historical or contemporary political battles attached to his name. Our mission today is strictly educational and analytical. We want to extract the factual content, the structural arguments, and just the sheer economic mechanics contained in the original source material. We want to show you the blueprint of the capitalist system, exactly as it was drawn in this text, totally impartially.
And that framing is essential because Volume 2 is fundamentally different from what most people associate with the name Marx. I mean, if you look at Volume 1 of Capital, the focus is almost entirely on how value is produced.
It's all about the factory floor, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's looking at the sweating gears of the factory floor, the extraction of surplus value from the worker, the length of the working day.
It's very tangible. Like you can see the worker sweating. You can literally see the machine running.
Right. But Volume 2 zooms out completely. Its entire mission is to map out how that value moves once it leaves the factory.
Right.
The focus shifts to the process of circulation of capital. It is a microscopic forensic accounting of how wealth basically shapeshifts to stay alive.
Shapeshifts, yeah.
It's about how money becomes a commodity, how that commodity is consumed in production to become a new commodity, and how that new commodity is transformed back into more money. It's the anatomy of a system in perpetual motion.
And to really grasp the sheer density and the almost, well, obsessive nature of this forensic accounting, we have to look at the incredibly chaotic context in which this volume was actually created. Because Marx didn't just sit down, write this out, and send it to a publisher.
Not even close, no.
Reading through the source material, the logistical nightmare that Friedrich Engels faced just to get this book into print is staggering. I mean, Karl Marx died in 1883, and he didn't leave behind a neat, finished manuscript.
No, he left a mountain.
A literal mountain.
Yeah.
Rough drafts, scattered notes, illegible handwriting, conflicting versions of different chapters.
Engels essentially had to perform literary archaeology. He published this volume in 1885, so that's 2 years after Marx's death, piecing it together primarily from what are known as manuscripts the 2nd through 8th. And he details in the prefaces just how agonizing this process was. He was dealing with texts written over a span of more than a decade in totally varying states of completion.
There's a note of the sources about the second version of the circulation section. Marx was apparently writing that specific part under severe duress.
Yeah, his health was failing.
Right, he was battling chronic insomnia, liver issues, general physical exhaustion. Yet he was still churning out this incredibly dense, highly theoretical, algebraic material. You could almost feel the struggle in the text itself.
You absolutely can. And Engels, who was Marx's the closest collaborator and, the co-author of the Communist Manifesto, fully understood the weight of what he was compiling. But he also understood exactly how it was going to be received by their own political allies.
This is the part that blew my mind.
Yeah, there is a fascinating letter Engels wrote while he was editing this volume, where he predicts that Volume 2 will greatly disappoint the vulgar socialists.
That quote stopped me in my tracks. You have the editor of the book, one of the founding figures of this massive socialist movement, openly predicting that his own supporters, like the people who've been waiting years for the sequel to Volume 1, are going to just hate it. Why?
Well, because of what they were expecting versus what they actually got. I mean, Volume 1 had grand historical narratives. It had sweeping, morally charged indictments of child labor.
That's emotional.
Very. It had vivid, horrifying descriptions of the suffering of the working class in English factories. The people waiting for Volume 2, these vulgar socialists, as Engels called those who preferred, easy slogans to rigorous theory, they expected more of the same.
Right. They wanted the hype.
Exactly. They wanted revolutionary rhetoric. They wanted fiery catchphrases and grand political speeches they could shout from a barricade.
They wanted an action movie. They wanted the thrilling sequel where the heroes finally storm the castle.
And instead, Engels delivered a rigorously scientific, highly minute, almost painfully dry examination of transactions that take place entirely within the capitalist class itself.
Yeah, no barricades in this one.
There are almost no workers suffering on barricades in Volume 2. Instead, you have pages upon pages detailing capitalists buying raw materials from other capitalists, calculating warehouse storage costs, tracking the physical depreciation of a steam engine over a 10-year period, and just measuring the velocity of inventory turnover.
I kept thinking of an analogy while reading this to try to wrap my head around it.
Let's hear it.
So if Volume 1 is the dramatic heist movie, the part where they crack the vault, bypass the lasers, physically steal the gold.
Okay, the Ocean's 11 part.
Exactly. And Volume 2 is the incredibly dry, methodical sequel about how the crew laundered that stolen money through a complex web of international shell companies, offshore accounts, and real estate holding firms.
That is a phenomenal way to conceptualize it. The heist is dramatic, sure, but the heist is ultimately pointless if the money isn't laundered.
Exactly. You can have $1 billion in stolen gold sitting in your garage, but if you can't legitimize it, get it back into the banking system, and actually spend it without getting caught, the heist basically failed.
Right.
So, applying that to the text, without the laundering mechanics detailed in Volume 2, the extraction of surplus value from the workers in Volume 1 would just grind to a halt, wouldn't it? The whole system would choke on its own unmonetized wealth.
Because the capitalists cannot eat the surplus value they extracted.
Right.
I mean, the factory owner who produces 10,000 yards of linen cannot wear all that linen, nor can they pay their bills with it. The extraction on the factory floor is completely meaningless unless that linen is pushed into the circulatory system of the market, sold, turned back into cash, and reinvested.
Wow, yeah.
And to understand how that laundering works, the text demands that we look at the exact atomic sequence of how capital shapeshifts. We have to look at what Marx calls the metamorphosis of capital.
The shape-shifting. Okay. The text breaks this down into 3 distinct stages, which form the complete circuit of capital. The grounding formula for this entire volume is M-C ... P ... C prime dash M prime.
Yes, the classic formula.
Now, I realize reading an algebra equation out loud makes terrible audio, so let's translate that into reality for everyone listening.
Absolutely. Let's walk through the 3 metamorphoses. For capital to survive, it must constantly move through this specific sequence. Stage 1 is the transformation of M into C. Right. So money capital transforms into commodity capital.
Okay.
The capital starts with a pile of money, which is M. They take that money into the commodity market. But they are not buying consumer goods for themselves. They aren't buying luxury dinners.
Right.
They are buying 2 very specific inputs for production. First, the means of production, which means the physical factory building, the raw cotton, the spinning machines. And second, labor power.
So they've spent their initial pile of money, they now own a building, a warehouse full of raw materials, and they've hired a workforce for the month. The money has physically shapeshifted into inert objects and human potential.
Exactly.
And that brings us to stage 2.
Stage 2 is denoted by P, which stands for productive capital. This is the only part of the circuit that takes place outside of the market. This is the factory floor itself.
So this is where Volume 1 happens.
Yes. The commodities purchased in stage 1 are now actively consumed in the labor process. The workers operate the machines to spin the raw cotton into yarn. The physical materials and the physical energy of the workers are fused together to create something entirely new.
And the crucial part here, drawing from that Volume 1 context, is that the workers are adding more value to the yarn than what they are being paid in wages. They are creating surplus value.
Which perfectly sets up stage 3. The new product emerging from the factory is C prime commodity capital, but that prime indicator means it contains more value than the sum of the original commodities purchased in stage 1.
It's pregnant with that extra value.
Right, it is pregnant with surplus value, but it is still just yarned, so the capitalist must take this C prime back out into the market and sell it, transforming it back into money, which is M prime.
And M prime is a larger pile of money than the original M they started with. The profit has actually been realized.
Exactly.
So the cycle is, just to recap, money, transformed into commodities, consumed in production, emerging as new commodities, and sold for more money. M to C, P, C prime to M prime.
It is a continuous, relentless loop, but the text forces us to look very closely at the very first step of that loop, the M to C phase.
Okay, why is that step so important?
Because there's a fascinating historical condition required for this formula to even begin. For the capitalist to buy C, they have to be able to buy labor power on the open market. And the text points out that this is not a natural state of human existence.
Right, that was a huge takeaway for me.
It requires a specific historical environment. Marx uses the example of the Russian farm laborer to illustrate this.
I found this part so illuminating. We take it for granted today that people just look for jobs. That's just what you do. But the text looks the Russian village community, the Obchina, which existed during Marx's time.
Yes.
In these communities, the land wasn't privately owned by individual farmers. It was owned communally by the village, and parcels were distributed to families to farm.
Which fundamentally changes the economic dynamic. Because the Russian peasant had guaranteed access to the communal land, they were not fully separated from their means of production. They could grow their own wheat, raise their own livestock, and basically feed their family without needing to earn a cash wage.
They weren't desperate.
No, they weren't.
If a capitalist rolled into a Russian village in 1870 and said, hey, I built a textile mill down the road, I need you all to come work for me for a monetary wage, the peasants would just look at him and say, why? I have potatoes in the ground, I have a house, I don't need your money to survive.
Exactly. The text argues that the capitalist system requires the worker to be a free wage laborer in a very specific dual sense of the word free.
What's the dual sense?
First, they must be legally free to sell their labor, meaning they aren't serfs tied to a lord's estate, and they aren't enslaved, they own their own bodies. But second, and more brutally, they must be free of any ownership of the means of production.
Oh, wow.
They must be entirely stripped of access to land, tools, or resources that would allow them to survive independently.
So they have to be legally free to sign a contract, but economically coerced into signing it because they literally have no other way to get food.
That's the core of it. If the worker still has access to their own land, the capitalist cannot buy labor power. And if they cannot buy labor power, stage 1 of the circuit, that M to C, breaks down before it even starts.
The machine won't turn on.
The money cannot transform into productive capital. The historical process of violently separating the peasantry from communal land, what is often called the enclosure of the commons, was an absolute prerequisite for this formula to function.
That really redefines how we conceptualize the core subject of this book.
Yeah.
Because I think if you stop 100 people on the street and ask them to define the word capital, 99 of them would picture a giant pile of money.
Oh, absolutely.
They'd picture Scrooge McDuck's vault or a billionaire's bank account. We think of capital as a noun, a static thing.
Yeah.
But based on this three-stage circuit, the text is forcefully arguing that capital is actually a verb.
That is probably the most vital conceptual leap you have to make to understand Volume 2. The text explicitly states that money is not capital in itself. A warehouse full of cotton is not capital in itself.
Right.
A highly advanced stamping press is not capital in itself. A pile of gold is just a shiny metal. A machine is just a combination of steel and wood. They only become capital when they are actively moving through this specific circuit.
They're only capital when they're shape-shifting.
Yes. Capital is value in motion. It is purely a process. If a capitalist buys 10 tons of raw steel and it just sits in a rail yard rusting for a year, it ceases to be capital.
It's just trash at that point.
It is just dead steel. If they successfully sell their finished cars for $50 million and just bury that M prime in a concrete bunker, it ceases to be capital. It is just dead money.
Wow.
The value must continually, ceaselessly move from money to commodity to production to new commodity to more money. If the motion stops, the capital dies.
It's less like a pile of treasure and more like the electrical grid. The electricity doesn't just sit there in the wires. It has to be constantly generated, transmitted, and consumed. Otherwise, the whole grid goes dark.
That's a great way to put it.
The capitalist system is a system of mandatory perpetual motion.
And once you accept that capital is a process in motion, a sort of biological imperative to keep circulating, then a new variable becomes the absolute obsession of the capitalist. If capital's motion, then the speed of that motion dictates everything.
Which brings us to the concept of the velocity of value. Because capital is a process, the element of time becomes the central metric of forensic accounting in this volume.
Time is money, quite literally here.
Right. The capitalist doesn't just want to complete the M to M prime circuit once. They want to complete it as many times as humanly possible within a given year, because every completed cycle yields another layer of surplus value.
To measure this, the text introduces the concept of turnover time. And the formula is quite elegant in its simplicity. Turnover time equals circulation time plus production time.
Okay, let's break those down. Production time is stage 2. It's the physical reality of making the thing. It's the time the cotton spends on the spindle or the time the car spends on the assembly line.
And circulation time is the time the value spends in the market, out in stages 1 and 3.
So outside the factory.
Right. It's the time spent negotiating and buying the raw materials, plus the time the finished goods sit on a shelf in a store or in a shipping container, just waiting for a buyer to finally hand over the cash.
The waiting game.
The capitalist is constantly at war with both of these times, trying to compress them as much as possible.
But the text makes a really crucial structural distinction here about how different physical things actually transfer their value during that production time. It divides productive capital into 2 categories: fixed capital and circulating capital.
And understanding this distinction is essential because it explains the granular mechanics of how value physically bleeds into a product.
Bleeds into it, I like that.
Let's start with circulating capital. This consists of the elements of production that are completely physically consumed in one single production cycle.
The classic examples from the sources are raw materials and wages, right?
Yeah, okay.
If you are baking bread, the flour you use is completely destroyed in the process of becoming bread. It's gone. You cannot bake 2 loaves of bread with the exact same bag of flour.
Therefore, the entire value of that flour is immediately and fully transferred to that specific loaf of bread. The capitalist has to completely replace that flour before they can start the next cycle.
Right. They have to buy more.
The same goes for the wages paid for a day's labor. That human energy is spent, and the capitalist must purchase it again tomorrow. That capital is constantly, rapidly circulating in and out of the production process.
But fixed capital operates on a completely different timeline.
Yes, fixed capital refers to the instruments of labor. We are talking about the industrial oven used to bake the bread, the factory building itself, the heavy delivery trucks. These items participate in a whole series of production cycles over many years.
Because an industrial oven doesn't disappear after baking 1 loaf of bread.
Right, it might last for 15 years.
So how does its value get into the bread?
It transfers its value bit by bit as it physically wears out.
Oh, okay.
So if an oven costs $15,000 and is mathematically calculated to last 15 years, it transfers $1,000 of its value to the total output of bread each year.
I see.
The oven remains physically fixed on the factory floor, anchoring the production process, while its financial value slowly, invisibly circulates out through the millions of loaves of bread it helps bake over a decade.
The oven is slowly bleeding its economic life into the bread until it dies and has to be replaced.
That's exactly it.
And this distinction between fixed and circulating capital is where the text launches a massive, heavily detailed critique of Adam Smith and the physiocrats. This is fascinating because Adam Smith is the grandfather of modern capitalism. He wrote The Wealth of Nations. What did the source material claim he got so fundamentally wrong here?
Marx argues that Adam Smith profoundly confused the internal mechanics of the factory floor with the external mechanics of the market. Smith confused the distinction between fixed and circulating productive capital with the broader forms of capital in the market, namely commodity capital and money capital.
Okay, wait. How does that confusion actually manifest? What was Smith looking at?
Smith was looking at the surface level of exchange. He believed that circulating capital simply meant capital that physically changes
Like
owners.
handing something over?
Right. He looked at a merchant buying a crate of shoes and selling it to a customer and said, the shoes moved from the merchant to the customer, therefore the shoes are circulating capital. But Marx argues this completely misses the deeper mechanical truth of how value is transferred during production itself.
So Smith was obsessed with the visible transaction. He was looking at the cash register, while this text says you have to look at the gears of the machine itself.
Precisely. Marx asserts that the distinction between fixed and circulating capital applies solely to the physical elements of productive capital inside stage 2.
The factory floor.
Yes, it is purely about how the instrument of labor gives up its value to the product. Flour gives it up all at once, an oven gives it up slowly over a decade. By confusing this physical transfer of value with the mere changing of hands in a store, Smith muddied the waters of economic theory.
He missed the actual mechanism.
He failed to see how value is actually preserved and transferred mechanically in the labor process, which blinded him to the deeper contradictions of the system.
To make this abstract theory of turnover time incredibly concrete, the source text actually brings in a specific mathematical example from an American economist of the era. This economist calculates the turnover of a hypothetical total capital of $50,000.
And dissecting this $50,000 is highly illustrative. The economist breaks it down into 3 different speeds of turnover. He states that half of this capital, so $25,000, is invested in buildings and heavy machinery.
Okay.
This is the fixed capital, and he estimates this portion turns over, meaning it fully transfers its value and needs to be replaced once every 10 years.
Okay, so that $25,000 is moving very slowly. It's on a 10-year cycle. Then he says a quarter of the total, $12,500, is invested in tools and smaller equipment. These wear out faster, turning over every 2 years.
Right. And the final quarter, the remaining $12,500, is employed in paying wages and purchasing raw materials. This is the circulating capital, and he calculates that this portion turns over twice a year.
So every 6 months.
Every 6 months, that money is spent, recouped in sales, and spent again.
So you have a single business representing one total capital of $50,000. But that money is fragmenting and moving at 3 entirely different speeds simultaneously.
Yes.
It's like a complex clock with a second hand, a minute hand, and an hour hand, all transferring value into the final product at different rates.
And the crucial insight the text draws from this asynchronous clock is how these different speeds dictate the sheer survival of the enterprise. Because the capital turns over at different rates, there are massive temporal gaps between when money is spent on production and when money finally returns from the sale of the product.
The gaps are where it gets dangerous.
The longer the turnover time, the more dangerous the gap.
I want to try an analogy here to see if we can visualize just how dangerous that gap is for you listening. Let's compare the turnover mechanics of running a fast food stand versus running a high-end barrel-aging whiskey distillery.
Oh, let's run the diagnostic on both.
Okay, so at a fast food stand, your inventory, your circulating capital of frozen burger patties and buns, turns over daily. You buy the meat in the morning, you cook it, you sell the burgers by the afternoon, and you have cash in your hand that night to buy more meat for tomorrow.
Very fast cycle.
The turnover time is incredibly fast, maybe 24 hours. Because the money comes back almost instantly, you don't need a massive cash reserve to survive. You just need enough cash to float 1 day's worth of inventory.
The circulation time is minimal and the production time is measured in minutes.
Right. But if you run a whiskey distillery, your physical production process requires the product to sit in an oak barrel for, say, 10 years.
A decade.
Your production time is a decade. That means for 10 years, you are paying workers to check the barrels, you are maintaining the temperature in the building, you are paying property taxes, you are buying new empty barrels, but you are not selling a single drop of 10-year-old whiskey. You are not seeing a single dime of M prime returned to you for a decade.
Which forces a massive structural question. How does the distillery avoid bankruptcy in year 3?
Exactly. How do they keep the lights on when all their capital is literally locked in wooden barrels?
The text asserts that the turnover period mechanically dictates how much latent money capital a business must keep on hand just to survive those gaps.
Latent meaning just sitting there.
Sleeping cash. The distillery requires a massive hoard of sleeping cash-latent money capital to float the business during its extended production time. They need millions of dollars just sitting in a bank account to pay wages for 10 years before the first bottle is sold.
And the fast food stand needs almost none.
The fast food stand requires very little latent capital. Therefore, the physical nature of the commodity being produced, whether it's a quick fry burger or a slow-aged whiskey, dictates the financial architecture of the business.
It is sheer physics applied to economics. The longer the production cycle, the bigger the financial shock absorber you need to survive.
And this detailed analysis of turnover times is why Volume 2 is so critical to understanding capitalism as a functioning system. It moves beyond the abstract theory of exploitation and maps the gritty, logistical reality of managing an enterprise through time. It proves that time itself is a structural constraint on capital.
But up to this point, we've only been looking at a single capitalist. We've been looking at the isolated fast food owner or the isolated distillery owner, managing their own internal clock of M to C to P to C prime to M prime. But the fast food stand doesn't magically manifest frozen burgers, and the distillery doesn't grow its own oak barrels.
Right. They aren't on an island.
They have to buy things from other capitalists, and they sell things to other capitalists and workers.
Which brings us to the absolute climax of Volume 2. To see how these turnover times and metamorphoses actually work on a societal level, we must zoom out. We have to leave the individual factory and map the entire macro machine. We move to the reproduction and circulation of the aggregate social capital.
And from reading the sources, this is where the text gets incredibly ambitious. It essentially tries to build a mathematical model of the entire global economy. To make it comprehensible, it divides every single productive enterprise in the capitalist world into two massive overarching departments.
The categorization is based on the physical use value of what is being produced. The text divides the total social capital into Department 1 and Department 2.
So let's define these for the listeners. Department I is the heavy industry side of things. It produces the means of production. We're talking about the factories that build industrial tractors, the coal mines, the steel mills, the companies that manufacture commercial conveyor belts. It produces the things that are used to make other things.
And Department 2 produces the articles of consumption. These are the commodities that are actually consumed by human beings.
Consumer goods.
Exactly. It includes the absolute necessities of life for the working class, like basic food, cheap clothing, housing materials. And it also includes the luxury goods consumed by the capitalist class like fine wine, silk suits, or expensive carriages.
Department 2 makes machines and raw materials. Department 2 makes food, clothes, and luxuries. Now here is the incredibly intricate puzzle the text builds, which we can call the Great Exchange. Because these two departments are completely separated, yet utterly dependent on each other for survival.
Think about the physical reality of the workers and capitalists in Department 2. They spend all day producing coal, forging steel, building industrial looms. But a human being cannot eat a lump of coal. The worker cannot wear a sheet of steel to keep warm. The output of Department 2 is biologically useless to the people producing it. Therefore, the people in Department I must buy their food and clothing from Department 2.
But the dependency flows both ways. The workers and capitalists in Department 2 spend all day making bread, weaving shirts, bottling wine. But you can't fix a broken industrial flour mill with a loaf of bread. You can't replace a worn-out delivery truck with a pile of shirts.
No, you cannot.
When the machines in Department 2 wear out, they absolutely must buy their replacement machinery and raw materials from Department 3.
Exactly. Therefore, a massive, highly coordinated, cross-departmental exchange must happen every single year for the economy to survive. Department 9 has to sell to Department 2, and Department 2 has to sell to Department 2. And the text provides a rigorous mathematical formula to explain how this exchange must balance.
Okay, I'm going to ask you to walk us through this math, but let's take it very slowly, because if we lose the thread here, the whole conclusion of the book basically falls apart.
I agree. We'll take it step by step.
We are looking at a baseline scenario the text calls simple reproduction. What does that mean?
Simple reproduction is a theoretical baseline. It assumes the economy is maintaining the exact same scale year after year. It is not growing, and it is not shrinking.
So it's perfectly stable.
Yes.
Yeah.
Every capitalist simply replaces their worn-out machines and spends all their profit on personal consumption. They don't reinvest to expand.
Okay, so it's a static economy. Let's look at the players. In Department I, the machine makers, the capitalist has to pay wages to their workers. In Marxist terms, this is variable capital, or V.
Okay.
And the capitalist also extracts a profit for themselves to live on, which is surplus value, or S.
Yes. The workers have their wages, which is V, and the capitalist has their profit, which is S. Now remember, they cannot consume the machines they built.
Right.
So both the workers and the capitalists in Department I take their money, their V and their S, and they walk over to Department 2 to buy food, clothing, and luxuries. So the total demand that Department I places on Department 2 is equal to their wages plus their profit. That's I, parentheses, V plus S.
Okay, I'm with you. Department I is spending V plus S on consumption goods. Meanwhile, let's look at Department 2, the food and clothes makers. Their industrial ovens and automated sewing machines are constantly wearing out.
They are?
They need to set aside money to buy replacement parts for next year. The money they set aside for physical machinery is their constant capital, or C.
Correct. And where do they buy those machines? They have to take their C and walk over to Department I to purchase them.
So here is the grand synthesis, the mathematical tightrope. For this entire macro economy to perfectly balance in simple reproduction, the amount of money Department I spends on food and luxuries, that's IV plus S, must exactly equal the amount of money Department 2 needs to spend to replace its machines, which is IC.
Yes.
The formula is IV plus S equals DIC.
That is the ultimate equation. The consumption demand of the heavy industry sector must perfectly match the replacement demand of the consumer goods sector.
Wait, looking at that equation, if that balance is off by even a fraction, the whole system seizes up, doesn't it? Let's say Department A introduces a new, highly efficient automated tractor factory, and they lay off half their workers.
Okay, a mass layoff.
Their total wages, their V plummets. That means IV plus S shrinks. They are now buying less food from Department 2. What happens to Department 2 then?
Department 2 suddenly finds itself with warehouses full of rotting food and unsold shirts because the workers in Department I can no longer afford to buy them. Because Department 2 can't sell its goods, it doesn't have the cash to replace its machines. So its demand for constant capital 2C shrinks. They cancel their orders for new tractors.
Which means Department I now has warehouses full of unsold tractors. It's a vicious cycle. Is this mathematical fragility essentially the text's structural blueprint for why economic crises happen?
It is the absolute root of what the text calls real crises. The system demands a perfect, proportionate exchange between the production of heavy machinery and the production of consumer goods. But capitalism is fundamentally uncoordinated.
Right, it's a free market.
Every individual capitalist in both departments is producing blindly for the market, trying to maximize their own individual profit, with absolutely no central planner ensuring that the macro equation IV plus S equals C will actually balance.
They're like millions of people throwing gears into a giant mechanical clock, entirely independently, and just hoping that by some miracle they all mesh perfectly and the clock ticks.
And the text notes a fundamental contradiction that guarantees the gears will eventually jam. Capitalist production is driven by competition to constantly develop the productive forces.
They have to keep growing.
The capitalists in department are forced to build bigger factories, more efficient machines, and pump out more means of production as if there is absolutely no limit to the market's capacity to absorb them.
But there is a limit.
Yes. The reality is that the ultimate limit to this boundless expansion is the poverty and restricted consuming power of the masses in Department 2. Because the system relies on extracting surplus value, the workers' wages are structurally kept as low as possible. They are paid only enough to reproduce their labor power.
So you have a system where Department Off is building machines capable of producing infinite consumer goods, but the workers who actually make up the bulk of the consumers literally don't have enough wages to buy them.
Exactly. Department I builds too many machines, which pushes Department 2 to build an ocean of consumer goods, but the masses lack the effective demand to purchase them.
The math breaks.
The equation IV plus S equals IMC violently ruptures. The result is a crisis of overproduction. The warehouses fill up, prices collapse, factories shut down, workers are laid off, and wealth is destroyed until the system violently rebalances itself at a lower level. The mathematical precision of the circulation formula reveals the inevitability of its own periodic breakdown.
That structural inevitability is just fascinating. It's not that a bad politician made a mistake or a greedy banker ruined things. The math itself guarantees a crash.
It's baked into the code.
And this leads us perfectly into the final major theme of the volume, because we've only been talking about simple reproduction, a static economy. But capitalism never wants to just stay the same size. It is biologically wired to grow.
Yes, what the text calls expanded reproduction, or the accumulation of capital. A successful capitalist doesn't just want to replace their one worn-out machine. They want to take their surplus value, buy a second machine, build a second factory, and hire more workers to extract even more surplus value.
But there's a logistical problem here. To build the second factory, You need a massive amount of cash all at once. You can't just buy a tenth of a factory every year with your annual profits. You need the full purchase price to start construction.
And this requirement introduces a massive structural bottleneck into the entire circulation process we've mapped out so far. To expand, a capitalist must temporarily withdraw money from circulation.
They have to save it.
They must hoard it. They sell their commodities for cash, but instead of immediately throwing that cash back into the market to buy more goods, they lock it away in a safe. They must hoard their annual profits for several years until it forms a large enough latent money capital to finally buy those new, expensive means of production.
Let me push back on this because I see a massive flaw in this if we apply the macro math we just learned.
Go for it.
If capitalist A is hoarding their money in a safe, that means they are selling their goods to the market, but they are not buying anything in return. Doesn't that immediately ruin the equation?
It certainly challenges it.
Right. Doesn't that mean capitalist B is now stuck with unsold inventory because capitalist A took the money out of the game? How does the global economy not just instantly seize up and crash if everyone is trying to hoard their cash to build new factories at the same time?
That is a brilliant observation, and it is a paradox that the text addresses head-on. The answer is blunt. They simply can't all hoard at the same time. The math strictly forbids it. If every capitalist decides to sell and hoard simultaneously, there are no buyers. Circulation stops, the commodities rot, and capital dies.
So how on earth does expanded reproduction actually happen then?
The system only survives if the hoarding is staggered and complementary.
Staggered. Oh.
It requires that while capitalist A is in their hoarding phase, withdrawing money from the market and building up their cash reserves, capitalist B must be in their expansion phase. Capitalist B must be actively spending the massive hoard they accumulated over the past 5 years, buying up the goods that capitalist A and others are producing.
It has to be an alternating rhythm. It's like the pistons in an engine, they can't all fire at the exact same millisecond or the engine just explodes. Some have to be compressing while others are combusting.
Exactly. There must be a continuous, delicately balanced rhythm of some capitalists hoarding, while others are actively throwing their hoards back into circulation.
That sounds incredibly precarious.
It is. Furthermore, the text points out a historical material reality required for this expansion. Because expanded reproduction constantly requires the formation of new money capitals to keep pace with the physical extension of production, there has to be an actual physical source of new money entering the macro system.
Right, because if you're just passing the exact same pool of gold coins back and forth between Department 1 and Department 2, you can never actually grow the total pie. You can only redistribute it.
Exactly. This is why the text argues that a massive historical supply of precious metals was an absolute material prerequisite for the birth and development of capitalist production.
It's the literal gold standard.
Specifically, the massive influx of gold and silver plundered from the Americas from the 16th century onward provided the physical liquidity necessary to form these hoards. Without that continuous injection of new physical money material from the gold and silver mines, the early capitalist expansion would have choked on its own lack of liquidity.
But waiting for a galleon full of physical gold to cross the Atlantic is incredibly slow and inefficient. And hoarding physical gold in a vault is also inefficient. It physically locks up the lifeblood of the economy for years while capitalist A saves up. And if there is one thing we've learned about the capitalist system, it absolutely abhors inefficiency.
Which brings up a massive structural tease that Volume 2 makes for the yet-to-be-published Volume 3.
Oh, a cliffhanger.
To solve the fatal bottleneck of hoarding, the capitalist system organically develops a new organ, the credit and banking system.
Okay, how does credit bypass the physical bottleneck of hoarding?
Instead of capitalist A locking their money in a private iron safe for 5 years while they save up for a factory, they deposit that money into a bank. The bank takes that latent, sleeping money, which capitalist A doesn't need to spend yet, and immediately lends it out to capitalist B, who needs the money right now to build their factory.
It creates a sort of financial quantum superposition. It allows the money to be in two places at once.
Exactly.
Capitalist A still technically have their hoard resting safely on the bank's ledger, but capitalist B is out in the real world actually spending the physical cash to buy steel and hire workers.
The banking system mobilizes the sleeping hordes. It lubricates the entire macro machine, allowing expanded reproduction to occur at a speed and scale that would be physically impossible if everyone had to rely solely on hoarding physical gold and waiting their turn. Credit allows the system to flex and stretch beyond its physical constraints.
But given everything we've discussed about the fragility of this system, there has to be a catch. Credit sounds like a miracle cure, but does it introduce a new disease?
It introduces a fatal magnification of the existing disease. As the text warns, this very banking system, which brilliantly solves the hoarding bottleneck, simultaneously becomes the most potent vehicle for overproduction.
Why? Because it breaks the feedback loop.
Precisely. Remember the delicate balance of IV plus S equals 2C. Credit allows capitalists to expand production based on borrowed money rather than actual realized profits from the market.
Okay.
It allows Department I to build massive new factories before Department II even knows if it needs new machines. It pushes the gear's production to spin faster and faster, increasingly divorced from the actual consuming power of the masses.
It artificially inflates demand until the bill comes due.
The text calls this the engine of the credit swindle. It allows the system to temporarily paper over the contradictions of poverty and limited markets. It keeps the system growing artificially, but in doing so, it ensures that when the limits of the market finally assert themselves, the resulting crisis is exponentially deeper and more destructive. Credit doesn't solve the contradictions of the circuit, it merely amplifies the scale of the inevitable crash.
This is a staggering amount of structural architecture to digest. Let me try to pull all these threads together and summarize the massive interconnected machine that Volume 2 maps out for us. We started down at the microscopic level, watching a single pile of money shape-shift into commodities, get consumed in the heat of the production process, and emerge as a new commodity pregnant with surplus value.
The atomic metamorphosis of capital.
And we saw how the sheer velocity of that cycle, the turnover time, mechanically dictates the survival of the business, forcing them to hold latent reserves based on the physical realities of what they produce, whether it's fast food or aged whiskey.
Right.
Then we zoomed out to the macro level, the grand organism itself. We saw how millions of these individual cycles intertwine across two massive societal departments, the heavy machine makers and the consumer goods makers.
We observed the delicate, fragile math required for them to exchange their goods and survive in simple reproduction.
And finally, we saw how the system's biological drive to constantly expand requires the hoarding of wealth, a fatal bottleneck that is eventually bypassed and terrifyingly amplified by the credit system, setting the stage for massive crises of overproduction.
It is a remarkable piece of forensic accounting. It strips away the ideological rhetoric, the political speeches, and the moral judgments of Volume 1 and simply asks mechanically, geometrically, how does this system function in time and space?
And that leads me to a final provocative thought for you, the listener, to mull over on your own time, drawing directly from the text's observation about the insatiable need for expansion. The text notes that capitalist production expands with incomparably greater rapidity and constantly requires the formation of new money capitals and the opening of new external markets to absorb the surplus goods that the domestic workers cannot afford.
The system must always find an outside to sell to.
So if the macro math mathematically requires Department 2 to constantly expand and constantly find new markets to absorb the surplus value they generate just to avoid a crisis, well, what happens when there is no outside left? What happens when the entire globe is fully integrated into this single shape-shifting circuit?
That is a chilling thought.
If the system relies on external expansion to resolve its internal contradictions, does the very mechanical perfection of the global circulation process guarantee its eventual permanent mechanical failure when it hits the absolute physical limits of the planet?
That is the ultimate question posed by the architecture of the system itself, one that echoes very loudly into the present day.
So as we sign off, I want you to think back to that X-ray machine we talked about at the very beginning. Volume 2 doesn't just show us a clean break in a bone. It shows us the entire circulatory system of the global economy, pumping wildly, relying on delicate mathematical balances, staggered hoarding, and the constant desperate injection of credit just to keep the heart beating.
It really does.
It shows us that the muddy waters of the global economy aren't just an accident or a glitch. They are the fundamental chaotic medium in which the system is designed to swim. Thank you for joining us on this incredibly deep dive into the mechanics of capital. Keep questioning the structures of the world around you, keep looking past the surface level of the transaction, and we'll see you next time.